She stood at the door with her children. That is where every workhouse story begins, at a door. And every woman who stood at that door understood with a clarity that required no explanation what walking through it would cost her. She understood because the door had been designed to make sure she understood. The building behind it had been deliberately constructed to look like a prison. The walls were high enough to block the view of the world outside. The windows were set 6 feet above the floor so that the people inside them could not see out, and the people outside could not see in. The entrance was plain, narrow, institutional. Nothing about it suggested shelter. Nothing about it suggested charity. Nothing about it suggested that the people who had built this place had given any thought to the experience of arriving at it with 2 children and no money and no alternative, and the specific kind of terror that accompanies the knowledge that you are about to hand yourself and everything you have left to an institution that has been engineered, by an act of parliament and by deliberate administrative design, to make your life inside it worse than the worst life available outside. The year is 1842. The place is any one of over 600 workhouses now operating across England and Wales under the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, and the woman standing at the door is about to lose everything she brought with her, including things she did not know she still had until they were taken. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what happened to a woman from the moment she crossed that threshold, what the workhouse did to her body, her family, her name, and her mind, and why the system that produced it was not a failure of compassion, but a success of policy. The cruelty was the point. The architects said so. They wrote it down. This is Dreadful History Files, and this is the story of the door that swallowed women whole and gave almost nothing back. The principle that designed the workhouse had a name. It was called less eligibility, and it was the foundation upon which the entire system rested. The Poor Law Commissioners who drafted the regulations following the 1834 Act stated the principle in language so clear that no subsequent generation could claim to have misunderstood it. The conditions inside the workhouse had to be worse than the conditions available to the poorest independent laborer outside it. Not equal, not comparable. Worse. The workhouse had to be the worst option available, because if it were anything other than the worst option, people might choose it voluntarily, and the system had been designed on the assumption that poverty was, in most cases, a failure of character that required correction rather than a condition of circumstance that required assistance. That assumption is where everything that follows originates. The diet, the uniform, the separation of families, the enforced silence, the pointless labor, the architecture that made the windows unreachable, and the walls unscalable, and the rooms undecorated, and the corridors cold, and the beds hard, and the food monotonous. All of it was intentional. All of it was policy. The workhouse was not a shelter that happened to be unpleasant. It was an instrument of deterrence that happened to contain human beings, and the unpleasantness was the mechanism by which the deterrence was supposed to operate. The commissioners understood this. They stated it. They published it. And then 600 buildings were constructed across England to implement it, and the people inside those buildings were treated accordingly. The Reverend John T. Becker, the Nottinghamshire clergyman whose workhouse at Southwell became the model for the national system, designed his building with the explicit intention of making the experience of entering it so degrading that only the truly destitute would submit to it. The building still stands. The National Trust maintains it. Visitors walk up the same gravel path that the women of the 1830s and 1840s walked, and they see the same red brick facade that those women saw, and the guided tour explains with appropriate solemnity that this was a place of last resort. What the guided tour cannot fully convey, because the building has been cleaned and lit and fitted with informational displays, is what the experience of arriving at that door actually felt like when the door was the last thing standing between you and the street was the last thing standing between your children and starvation. She entered, and the first thing the workhouse took was her clothes. The admission process was the same across the system, because the regulations that governed it were national, issued by the Poor Law Commissioners from Somerset House in London, and applied to every union workhouse in England and Wales. Upon arrival, the woman was interviewed by the relieving officer, or the workhouse master, to establish that she qualified for admission, which meant establishing that she was destitute, which meant establishing that she had exhausted every other option and had nothing left. Once admitted, She was taken to the receiving ward and stripped. Her clothes were removed, catalogued, and stored. She was washed. Her hair was examined for lice. A medical officer inspected her body. She was issued with a workhouse uniform. The uniform was the first act of erasure, and it was comprehensive. For a woman, it consisted of a shapeless dress in striped fabric that reached the ankles, a shift underneath, long stockings, knee-length drawers, a poke bonnet, and hobnailed boots. In some workhouses, the stockings were bright yellow, a detail specific enough to function as a marker visible at a distance. In some workhouses, pregnant women and women classified as fallen, meaning unmarried mothers, were given a different uniform from the other female inmates, a distinction designed to make their specific category of moral failure visible to everyone in the institution at all times. The uniform did not fit. It was not intended to fit. It was intended to replace the clothes she had arrived in with a garment that identified her as a pauper and removed from her the last visible trace of the person she had been before she walked through the door. Her own clothes were stored. They would be returned to her if and when she left, but leaving required giving reasonable notice, and if she left and later returned, she would have to go through the entire admission process again, stripped and washed and uniformed and processed, as though she had never been there at all. The system had built a cost into departure that made departure feel like a second admission rather than a release, and the cost was designed to make people think carefully before leaving without a plan, which in practice meant that people who entered rarely left until they had no choice, or until the institution discharged them. If you are watching Dreadful History Files for the first time, subscribe now, because the next thing the workhouse took from her was considerably worse than her clothes, and the story of how it was done has never been told the way it needs to be. The second thing the workhouse took was her children. The regulations issued by the Poor Law Commissioners in 1835 divided workhouse inmates into 7 classifications: able-bodied men aged 16 and above, able-bodied women aged 16 and above, boys aged 7 to 16, girls aged 7 to 16, children under 7, men who were infirm or ill, women who were infirm or ill. These 7 groups were to be kept entirely separate from one another at all times, during work, during meals, during the few hours of leisure the schedule permitted, during sleep. Married couples, including elderly couples who had spent decades together, were housed apart. Husbands and wives were placed in separate wards in separate sections of the building and could not visit each other, speak to each other, or acknowledge each other's existence within the institutional routine. For a woman entering with children, the classification system operated as follows. Children under 7 could be housed with their mother. Children over 7 could not. A woman who arrived at the workhouse with an 8-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old son would keep the son with her in the women's ward and lose the daughter to the girls' section of the building, a section she was not permitted to enter and from which her daughter was not permitted to leave. The regulations stated that mothers should be given reasonable access to their children, but what constituted reasonable access was determined by the master and matron of the workhouse, not by the mother, and the definition of reasonable operated within a system whose entire design philosophy was the elimination of comfort. In practice, mothers and children housed in separate sections of the same building might see each other once a week, or once a fortnight, or not at all, depending on the workhouse and the people running it. The architecture reinforced the separation. Exercise yards were segregated by classification. Dining halls were segregated. Chapel, where the entire population of the workhouse assembled together, was often the only space where a mother might see her child across a room and be unable to speak to her, unable to touch her, unable to do anything except sit in silence and know that her daughter was alive, and that the distance between them, which was measured in yards, was enforced by a system that had the full authority of the law behind it. The children who grew up in workhouses were not educated in any meaningful sense. They were taught basic reading and basic arithmetic, and trained in manual skills that would prepare them for employment in domestic service or factory work. The quality of the teaching varied from workhouse to workhouse, but the principle beneath it was consistent. These were the children of the destitute, and the education they received was designed to prepare them for the lives the system had already decided they would lead, which were the same lives their parents had led, which were the lives that had produced the destitution that had brought them to the workhouse in the first place. The cycle was built into the curriculum. Children were also hired out. Boys could be sent to work in factories or mines. Girls could be placed in domestic service. The Andover Workhouse scandal of 1845, which produced a parliamentary inquiry and national outrage, revealed that conditions in at least one workhouse had deteriorated so thoroughly that inmates assigned to crush bones for fertilizer were so hungry that they were eating the rotting marrow from the bones they were supposed to be processing. Andover was not an anomaly. It was the visible tip of a system that had not been inspected for 6 years, despite regulations requiring annual inspection. And the inquiry revealed that many workhouses across the country were being operated for the profit of the people running them, with the inmates functioning as a resource to be exploited, rather than a population to be supported. The third thing the workhouse took was her voice. Silence was not a preference in the Victorian workhouse. It was a regulation. The rules governing inmate conduct were published and posted and enforced with penalties that began at reduced rations and escalated through solitary confinement to criminal prosecution. The general workhouse rules issued by the Poor Law Commissioners specified that any pauper who shall make any noise when silence is ordered to be kept, or who shall use obscene or profane language, or who shall by word or deed insult or revile the master or matron, or any other officer of the workhouse, or any of the guardians could be punished. The phrase "any noise when silence is ordered" meant, in practice, most of the working day. Conversation between inmates was prohibited during work hours. Laughter was prohibited. Singing was prohibited. Any audible evidence that the person inside the uniform was a person at all was treated as an infraction. The punishment records from Victorian workhouses have survived in some cases, and they document infractions and penalties with the bureaucratic thoroughness the system applied to everything. In Ampthill, a girl named Letitia Sharman was recorded as having been punished by the master, who noted that he had slapped her with his hand, twice. In Norwich in July 1867, 5 girls who had absconded from the workhouse school for a single morning and returned the same evening were punished with 3 meals of bread and water, 3 days of oakum picking, and what the punishment book recorded as privately punished by matron. Private punishment was, in the judgment of historians who have studied these records, almost certainly corporal punishment administered behind closed doors, a practice that was technically against the regulations for female inmates, but which the punishment books recorded with a frequency that suggests it was standard rather than exceptional. Women who refused to work were punished. Women who spoke when silence was ordered were punished. Women who attempted to see their children outside the designated visiting schedule were punished. Women who complained about the food were punished. The penalties were bread and water for a specified number of meals, oakum picking as additional labor, confinement in the refractory ward, which was the workhouse term for solitary confinement, or, for persistent offenders, referral to the magistrate for criminal prosecution under the vagrancy laws. A woman who had entered the workhouse because she had nothing could be prosecuted for the crime of not accepting nothing quietly enough. Most of what you have heard so far was documented in the workhouse's own records. These women were observed, catalogued, classified, and punished by a system that kept meticulous records of its own operations and then stored those records in parish archives where they remained largely unread for a century. If you believe their experience deserves to be told honestly, leave a comment. Tell me what part of this you did not know was real. Your engagement is what keeps Dreadful History Files reaching the people who need to hear these stories. The fourth thing the workhouse took was her time. The daily schedule in a Victorian workhouse was issued by the Poor Law Commissioners in 1835, and it governed every waking moment of every inmate's day, with a rigidity that left no margin for individual variation, personal need, or human preference. Rising was at 6 in the morning from March to September, and 7 in the morning from September to March. Breakfast was at 6:30 or 7:30 accordingly. Work began at 7 or 8, and continued until 12. Dinner was at 12. Work resumed at 1 and continued until 6. Supper was at 6. Bed was at 8. Those were the hours. They did not change. They did not accommodate illness, exhaustion, grief, or the specific psychological condition of a woman who had been separated from her children and dressed in a stranger's clothes and told that the sound of her own voice was an infraction. The work assigned to women was domestic in nature, which sounds unremarkable until you understand the volume and the conditions. Women did the laundry for the entire workhouse, which in a large institution could house several hundred inmates. They scrubbed floors. They cleaned wards. They cooked meals. They sewed and mended uniforms. They picked oakum, which was the process of unraveling old tarred rope by hand until the fibers separated. The tar cut into the fingers. The work was monotonous, repetitive, and designed not to produce anything of particular value, but to keep the hands occupied and the mind too tired to generate the kind of discontent that might lead to disobedience. Oakum picking deserves particular attention because it was the workhouse's signature task, the job that functioned both as labor and as punishment, and the job that left physical evidence on the bodies of the women who performed it. Old ship's rope, thick with tar and salt, was issued in bundles, and the inmate was required to pull the rope apart fiber by fiber until the individual strands separated. The tar made the rope rigid and resistant. The fibers cut into the skin of the fingers and palms. A daily quota was assigned, typically 3 or 4 pounds of picked oakum per person, and failure to meet the quota was an infraction punishable under the same system that punished noise and speech and unauthorized movement. The fingers of women who picked oakum for weeks or months developed a specific pattern of damage, cracked skin over calluses over earlier cracks, that the workhouse generated as reliably as it generated its meal schedule and with roughly the same level of institutional concern. The fifth thing the workhouse took was her body. The diet in a Victorian workhouse was determined by dietary tables issued by the Poor Law Commissioners and enforced by the Board of Guardians. The principle of less eligibility applied to the food as it applied to everything else. The diet had to be adequate to sustain life and inadequate to provide satisfaction. Breakfast was bread and gruel, a thin, watery porridge made from oatmeal and water that provided calories, without flavor, and nutrition without pleasure. Dinner, the main meal, was bread and cheese on some days, boiled meat with potatoes on others, soup made from the water the meat had been boiled in on the days between. Supper was bread and cheese or bread and broth. Meat appeared perhaps twice a week, in portions that the dietary tables specified down to the ounce. Women received smaller portions than men. Children received less than women. No fruit, no fresh vegetables, no variation in the weekly rotation. The same meals in the same order on the same days every week for as long as the inmate remained inside the institution. The effect of this diet on a body that was simultaneously performing hours of physical labor in cold, poorly ventilated buildings was cumulative and predictable. Malnutrition was not an accident of the workhouse diet. It was a feature of its design. The diet had been calibrated to sit below the level of what the poorest independent laborer might eat. And since the poorest independent laborer in Victorian England was already eating badly, the workhouse diet sat at a level that modern nutritional science would classify as deficient in iron, in vitamins, in the basic components a human body requires to maintain its own systems under physical stress. The sleeping conditions completed the assault. Dormitories were communal, beds were narrow, bedding was minimal, and heating, if it existed at all, was inadequate. The workhouse at Southwell, the model institution, had no fireplaces in its wards. The walls were bare plaster. The windows were set high to prevent any view and any draft of air that the cold could not ride in on. Women slept in rows, in beds that might be shared, in rooms that the building's own architect had designed to be as uncomfortable as architecture could make them without crossing the line into outright cruelty, a line that the system had defined so narrowly that almost anything on its side could be presented as adequate. The sixth thing the workhouse took was her future. Unmarried mothers received a particular category of treatment that the workhouse system had designed with the same precision it applied to everything else. A woman who entered the workhouse pregnant and unmarried was classified separately from the married women. In some workhouses, she was given a different uniform to distinguish her from the other female inmates, a visible marker of her specific moral failure that she wore every day in every room of the institution where anyone could see it, and everyone did. She was classified as fallen, a word the system used with the confidence of an institution that had never questioned whether the word might apply more accurately to the structures that had produced her situation than to the woman living inside it. Her baby, once born, would remain with her in the workhouse until it was old enough to be classified separately, at which point it entered the system as a workhouse child and was subject to the same regime of discipline, diet, and education that the system applied to all the children it contained. The infant mortality rate in workhouses was devastating. In some London workhouses in the 1860s, The recorded death rate for infants under 12 months approached 80%. The babies died of malnutrition, of respiratory illness, of the cascading failures that follow when a newborn body does not receive what a newborn body requires. They died not because the workhouse intended them to die, although the system's capacity for concern about their survival was limited by a budget that had been designed to discourage their mothers from being there in the first place. They died because the workhouse killed them with arithmetic. The same arithmetic that determined the dietary tables and the staffing levels and the heating budget and every other variable that the Board of Guardians had calculated with the precision of men who were very good at numbers and very poor at imagining what numbers felt like when they were applied to a body. The woman who survived the workhouse, if she survived, left it with nothing she had not entered with, and considerably less of some things. Her health, if she had arrived with any remaining, had been depleted by the diet and the labor and the cold. Her connection to her children, if they had survived, had been attenuated by the separation the system had enforced. Her reputation, which in Victorian England functioned as a form of currency without which employment and housing and social participation were difficult to obtain, had been marked by the workhouse uniform she had worn in public, by the yellow stockings visible on the street, by the fact that everyone in the parish knew where she had been and what it meant that she had been there. She left, if she left, through the same door she had entered. Her stored clothes were returned. She put them on. If they still fit, which was not guaranteed after months of the workhouse diet and the workhouse labor and the workhouse cold, she walked out into whatever was waiting for her on the other side, which was usually the same situation that had driven her in, minus the months or years that the workhouse had consumed, and plus the stigma that the workhouse had attached to her name. The workhouse was not a failure. That point requires emphasis because the instinct when confronting the conditions described in this video is to assume that someone somewhere made a mistake, that the system broke down, that the intentions were good but the execution was poor. The intentions were documented. The execution was precise. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 was designed to deter poverty by making the alternative to poverty worse than poverty itself, and it succeeded. People feared the workhouse. They feared it so thoroughly that they endured conditions outside it that would have been considered intolerable if the comparison had been anything other than what the workhouse offered. The workhouse functioned exactly as its architects intended. It produced exactly the deterrent effect they described in their published reports. And the human cost of that function, measured in separated families and malnourished children and women who picked oakum until their fingers bled and ate gruel in silence in buildings designed to look like prisons, was not an unintended consequence. It was the mechanism. The woman at the door knew this. She knew it before she arrived. She knew it because everyone knew it. The workhouse was the worst thing that could happen to you, and the system had made certain of that, because if it were not the worst thing that could happen to you, it would not serve its purpose. She stood at the door with her children, and she made a calculation that no parent should have to make, and that the system had designed specifically to force. She could stay outside and watch her children go hungry, in a world that had decided their hunger was their mother's fault. Or she could walk through that door and hand herself and her children to an institution that would feed them and house them and separate them and silence them and dress them in the uniform of their own destitution and keep them for as long as they had nothing, which might be months, or might be years, or might, for the children who grew up inside and knew no other world, be the rest of a childhood that the system had swallowed whole and processed into something that served its budget and met its quotas and satisfied the ratepayers who funded it and appeared, on the published inspection reports, to be operating within acceptable parameters. She chose the door. She almost always chose the door, because the alternative was worse, and the system had been specifically designed to make sure that the alternative was always, only just, worse. The workhouse buildings survive. Some are museums now. Some are apartments. Some are council offices. The one at Southwell is the best preserved, maintained by the National Trust, visited by school groups who walk the corridors and look at the displays and try to imagine what it felt like to sleep in those rooms and eat that food and wear those clothes and lose your children to a system that had decided, with the full authority of an Act of Parliament and the full resources of the British state, that your poverty was a moral condition requiring correction rather than a human condition requiring help. The women who entered those buildings are not named in most of the records that survive. They appear as numbers in admission registers, as entries in punishment books, as figures in the dietary tables that specified how many ounces of bread and how many pints of gruel and how many days of silence the system had allocated to their continued existence. The records are thorough. The records are precise. The records contain everything except the one thing that would have made them human, which is the voice of the woman they describe, speaking for herself, in her own words, about what it felt like to stand at that door and know what walking through it would take from her, and walk through it anyway, because her children were hungry and the system had made sure there was nowhere else to go. She deserved better than that door. They all did. And the fact that the door existed at all, that it was built and maintained and funded and defended and operated for nearly a century before the system that produced it was finally dismantled, is not a chapter of history that belongs in the past. It is a reminder, sharp and uncomfortable, and exactly as unpleasant as the people who designed it intended, that systems built on the principle that suffering is a useful tool of policy will always find people to suffer inside them. The question is never whether the system will produce suffering. The question is whether the people watching from outside the walls will decide that the suffering matters. The women behind the door already knew the answer to that question. They had been living inside it. Subscribe to Dreadful History Files. The past was not what they told you it was. And the door is still open. The next story is waiting on the other side.